Hello, in this video I want to discuss how someone who has been a refugee or is an immigrant or has become a naturalized citizen, or they consider themselves to be that, how can they be against the mass immigration policy? And there are reasons for that, and it is not white or black. Now, I get that question because I was a refugee. When I came to Sweden, me and my sister, we had like random clothes, and I remember the way from like the Balkans was full of children, because for us children we always had someone to play with, because everyone was sort of below 10-12 years old, and there were lots of children, 5-6, and the mothers and older people. Now, when you compare that to the actual immigration wave in Sweden the last year and this year, there are no waves of small children and women. In fact, the men who come are between 17 and 35, 40, and they have been migrating from, for example, Afghanistan, who have just the other day voted so comfortably to reject the men who Sweden wants to send back to Afghanistan, men who have no reasonable right to become asylum seekers or immigrants. It will be interesting to see what Sweden will respond, what will the Vikings say now? Anyway, so these men have been going from, for example, Afghanistan, step by step, month by month, year. I mean, some have done it for years. Some have been in Greece, in Italy. Some have even worked in various countries. But they all want to get to Sweden because Sweden is full of benefits. Because Sweden has not been updated. Back in the 70s, Sweden had a very strong social welfare system, which works in a population that is homogeneous and honest. And Sweden has had 200 years of building up an honesty and a cultural climate based on trust. Now, with the influx of various cultures, that is getting eroded. So, back to that. So, personally, I'm against that kind of immigration. Okay, and that has nothing to do with women and children and people in need. That is one thing. So often, hot-headed, triggered critiques, or a person who just want to get mad, they don't realize the difference. And as an immigrant, as a naturalized Swede, as a Bosnian Swede, I've seen that, and most of the people in my situation agree with me, and even people who have come to Sweden years and years ago now. I mean, I'm not going to go into the situation in Sweden because that is so well, well reported upon. Just go on Google. I've mentioned something in my videos, but just to shortly mention something, it will become more enclavization. You will have enclaves in Sweden which are a totally different culture. It's not Europe. It's like that now. Cars are burning, guns are firing. There's a Sharia police in those areas, and life will be normal in Sweden, but you will have these enclavized areas, and the cities will be sort of a melting pot for normal citizens and those violent sort of other culture ghetto citizens. And that's sad, that's unfortunate, because like 15-20 years ago, those areas in some regards it was like, oh, that it's a bit of a exotic culture, they are different. But those people who have come recently in the past years, it's just gone way extreme. For example, here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like in Mostar, you have, I don't know how many, but you have like 15 mosques or something along the river here. Old mosques that were destroyed during the war, which was sad because it's a cultural history. So they were like 400, 300, 500 years old. And I can walk around this city, and I will see some women have like the scarf, what's it called? Yeah, and that's that. And even those minarets are on, and you hear the church bells. So everything is on. But in Sweden, I can be in the central, and I can see ninjas, all women all covered up, and people with sort of serious scarves. So that is just the difference of sort of a very present sort of Islam here that's been here for many hundreds of years, which has sort of acclimatized and it's there, but it's sort of a cultural phenomenon. It's mixed with the other stuff here. But in Sweden, you have like the lowest form of anything coming from these immigration waves, especially regarding Islam. So they are very sort of focused on showing themselves, having their rights. I mean, they want to have their religious wearings on work and all that, even though it is not practical. So I'm against that, because Sweden is not made for that. And even if those people that I'm talking about who have come to Sweden, the Muslims, like the really sort of lower caste Muslims, almost analphabetic types, even if they came here, they wouldn't be welcomed. But I guess people here are more, in Bosnia are more, they wouldn't stand that because they barely stand each other. Here, even people look the same, speak the same language. Yeah, but so I'm against that. And another thing, when a country becomes 20% foreign culture, the situation is not like that in Sweden. I've seen like statistics of how many Muslims there are in Sweden, like everything from 5 to 15 now. 5% is more realistic, 5, 6, because sometimes they account like a person who is from Bosnia, for example, they are Muslim, even though Bosnia and Herzegovina is not a religious country. It's a secular country. So that's the way to sort of trigger up the statistic into fear-mongering, but realistically 5, 6. And that doesn't mean they have to be Muslims. They can be of any type. I mean, most people are just what they are because of tradition, Yeah, religion is just an organized form of club, But the culture is a problem. And when Sweden become, if it would become too much of that, it would be a problem. So I'm against that. I like to preserve nature. I'm a very environmentalistic kind of person, and I also want to preserve humans, cultures, and also Swedes. They look a certain way. I want Sweden to be as it is, and I personally want to be sort of an exotic part of it, even though I'm not that far from Sweden genetically and all that. But and those two things are important in this discussion. Like the first one is who has the right to be a refugee and who is just an opportunistic migrant. And the second is, even when you allow everything in, there's a certain limit by which if you pass that, a nation won't go back. The same in nature. Like if habitat passes a certain point, it will no longer be able to be resilient and get back. So if a Sweden with its friendly culture gets too much of this sort of barbaric stuff, it will never become that safe and good again, and that is what is happening. So and this is too much for some people. As some people would have lost me just in the beginning when I mentioned I'm against. You're something, they will just call you names. But when you think about it, this is very common sense. And it is interesting that many immigrants like myself, or naturalized citizens. I mean, Sweden for me is the language I know best. It's I spent most of my life there, so it's very much in me. But anyway, people like me and people here also, I'm always interested to hear like what people outside of a country think about things. You know, what do people think about Bosnia, Croatia? You know, what do people think about Sweden? And what is an extreme thing in Sweden, for example, what I'm saying right now, is pretty much what people accept as a normal reaction, observation outside. And it is very important to know this, because this whole hysteria, this whole common sense doesn't always have to be a good thing, you know, in science versus common sense. But in some things like this, the most fierce fighter against it is the Swedish people. I mean, the people in a sense, like generally, like the way they spend tax money, the way they let this sort of narrative corridor, åsiktskorridoren, as they call it in Sweden, where only a certain kind of information is allowed to pass. And what happens is, you know, when the media and the politicians ignore actual reality, you get a crack in that, and you get sort of various forms of parties, of problems and issues and opinions that could have just been solved if this narrative corridor wasn't there in the beginning, in the first place. And that just shows how much less of free speech there is in Sweden up till maybe some months ago. This summer things changed, and we'll see what will happen. But that is why in this video I wanted to comment on this and explain how come a former refugee can be against refugees, which sounds stupid, but it depends on, is that really a refugee, or are those men coming to a country just there for the benefits, which is a proven thing. And you have to also realize this, that Europe has a stagnating population. Africa and other continents will have an explosional growth of populations. So there is not much here for everyone, for the whole world. Everybody loves to live in Europe and the United States, but you know, a party for 10 people can host 15, but when 40 people come in, you know, you understand my point. So there needs to be a very hard regulation on this, and especially when we're talking about preserving cultures and people and ways of living. Now, what I see is that, for example, in Eastern Europe, no matter how many problems they have with each other or whatever, they have a stronger sense of what is actually happening. And some Western European countries have that too, but Sweden, Germany, you know, Holland, the Netherlands, and even in England to some part are really in trouble, especially Germany and Sweden. So that's why I'm against, or that's why I criticize this that is going on, because it has, you know, the more people need to do that, because still the corridor, the narrative corridor, doesn't allow for criticisms. So when a Swedish TV channel has experts involved, they are all coming from the same political color and with the same belief. So people can have a difference of opinion within a party or a political color, but they always call in people who have the same. And that's basically. That's why I feel relaxed and justified in my opinion. There is no racism, Nazism, fascism. There is no phobia. you know, it's funny because if you criticize Islam, you're an Islamophobe. If you criticize something about Zionism, you're an anti-Semite. If you mention something good about welfare, oh, you're a leftist. If you mention something good about stronger borders, oh, you're a, you know, Trump or fascist or whatever. You're an Orban. So once again, it's hard to talk to those people and have a discussion with them. But I think that this needs to be clarified as how a person who has been a former refugee, grown up in a country or began a life there, can be against invasion, basically. Because refugees aren't really flooding Europe. They haven't been doing that. Last year you had a news media might have taken a picture of a family, put it on the news. And of course, a person who doesn't have time to get involved in what's going on thinks like, oh, you know, these are harmless, you know, victims. And they are. But most of them were not. So just go and look at those clips of, you know, mass, this sort of mass exodus, they're coming in of men, and the problems have just begun. So am I entitled to this opinion? Yes, I am, you know, because I think the same about the two countries that I have not residence in, but I have the citizenship. You know, I don't think this for that country and this for that one. You want the best for both of them. And I also want the best for Europe in the long run, because the world will have lots of trouble, and Europe can't be sort of this sort of party on the 5th floor where everybody wants to come in. You know, that's just a fact. That's just reality. And I mentioned this in an earlier video, the conflict between perfect idealism and you know, necessity. Eroding your idea of a perfect ideal way to act with necessity doesn't have to be breaking against the moral. It is basically practical idealism, you know, practical morality. Because if we all just lived in our arbitrary, abstract ideas, no problem. But we live in a material world too, you see. So you have to have a materialistic idealism. You have to have a practical implementation of ideas. And if we lose the culture in Europe, if we lose the traditions, the hundreds and hundreds of years Europe has been fighting against extreme religion, wars, and all that, and the world will lose its best source of culture and progression. In my opinion, I'm a European. I have a Eurocentric view, and so far we have not met any aliens. So that means the universe will lose something very beautiful and fine. So think about that, and take care, and all the best.